September 2008, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke sit before Congress. They explain the gravity of the situation. The financial system is collapsing. Without intervention, the economy will enter depression. They need $700 billion immediately to buy troubled assets from banks. Congress debates, markets wait. The first vote fails. The Dow falls 777 points, the largest point decline in history at that time. 4 days later, Congress passes TARP. The government intervenes. The system stabilizes. Eventually, it recovers. The lesson learned. When government acts decisively with sufficient resources, financial crises can be contained. The tools exist, the power exists. Political will can be summoned when the stakes are clear enough. Governments can stop crashes. This belief has dominated for 15 years. Markets assume that when crisis comes, government will intervene. Political gridlock will break. Emergency powers will be invoked. Whatever it takes will happen. The government backstop is reliable, but the 2026 crash will be different. Not because governments won't try to intervene, they will. Not because they won't understand the severity, they will. But because the constraints that prevented action in previous crises have intensified while the problems have compounded. The gap between what's needed and what's possible has become unbridgeable. Let me show you exactly why governments can't stop the 2026 crash. The fiscal constraints, the political paralysis, the timing problem, the coordination failure, and why even perfect knowledge of what's coming doesn't create the ability to prevent it. The fiscal constraint, the debt that prevents borrowing more. In 2008, U.S. federal debt stood at 64% of GDP, high by historical standards but manageable. When crisis hit and government needed to deficit spend, bond markets absorbed the issuance. Interest rates fell to historic lows. Debt service remained manageable, even as debt doubled. The fiscal response was massive. TARP cost $700 billion, though ultimate losses were much smaller. Fiscal stimulus in 2009 totaled $787 billion. Automatic stabilizers, unemployment insurance, and reduced tax revenue added another $1 trillion annually. Total deficits from 2009-2012 exceeded $5 trillion. The economy absorbed this because debt started from a manageable level. Markets believed the U.S. could service the additional debt. Foreign buyers, especially China and Japan, continued purchasing treasuries. The dollar remained stable. Yields stayed low. By early 2026, federal debt exceeds 120% of GDP. This is double the 2008 level. The debt accumulated through post-2008 stimulus, pandemic response, and chronic deficits from entitlement spending and insufficient revenue. Interest payments on this debt now exceed $900 billion annually. That's more than defense spending, more than Medicaid. It's 15% of federal spending going purely to service existing debt. And this is at average interest rates around 4%. If rates rise to 6%, interest payments reach $1.5 trillion annually. When the 2026 crash hits and recession reduces tax revenue, deficits will explode. Automatic stabilizers alone could add $1.5 trillion annually. Unemployment insurance, Medicaid expansion, reduced income and corporate tax revenue. These happen automatically without new legislation. Any discretionary stimulus adds to this. A $1 trillion stimulus package means $2.5 trillion annual deficits. Maybe $3 trillion, the debt trajectory becomes vertical. Debt to GDP accelerates toward 150% within 2 years. At this level, bond market vigilantes emerge. Investors question sustainability. They demand higher yields to compensate for increased risk. The Treasury must pay 6%, then 7% to place new debt. Higher yields make the debt problem worse. The fiscal math becomes impossible. Adding $3 trillion in debt annually while interest rates rise means interest payments could exceed $2 trillion within years. At that point, interest payments consume 30% of federal revenue. The budget is unsustainable without dramatic tax increases or spending cuts. But tax increases during recession deepen the recession. Spending cuts during recession do the same. The government is trapped. They can't deficit spend enough to offset the recession without creating a sovereign debt crisis. But they can't not spend without allowing depression. This constraint didn't exist in 2008. Debt was 64% of GDP. Adding another 30-40% was painful but manageable. Starting from 120%, adding another 30-40% triggers debt crisis concerns. Bond markets might refuse to finance U.S. deficits at reasonable rates. If Treasury auctions fail, if the government can't place debt, the entire framework collapses. The Fed must monetize debt directly, buying treasuries to fund government. This destroys currency credibility, inflation accelerates. The dollar crashes. The crisis becomes a currency crisis on top of everything else. The fiscal constraint means government can't respond to the 2026 crash the way they responded to 2008. The balance sheet space doesn't exist. The room for additional borrowing is limited. And using that room risks triggering a sovereign debt crisis that makes everything worse. The political paralysis, why nothing passes. Even if fiscal space existed, political dysfunction prevents using it. The U.S. government in 2026 is far more paralyzed than in 2008. The ability to pass emergency legislation has essentially disappeared. In 2008, Congress was divided. Democrats controlled both chambers, Republicans were in opposition. But when Paulson and Bernanke explained the stakes, enough Republicans joined Democrats to pass TARP. The final vote was 263, 171 in the House. It wasn't easy, it wasn't smooth, but it happened. The political environment in 2026 makes such cooperation virtually impossible. Congressional polarization has intensified dramatically. The center has disappeared. Each party's caucus is more ideologically uniform and more hostile to the other party. The primary system has radicalized both parties. Republicans face primary challenges from the right. Democrats face challenges from the... Any vote that can be portrayed as compromise or betrayal becomes electoral liability. Cooperation carries political cost. The constituent bases have diverged. Republican voters, especially the MAGA coalition, are deeply hostile to corporate bailouts and government intervention in markets. They viewed 2008 as crony capitalism that benefited Wall Street at Main Street's expense. They will not support similar measures. Progressive Democrats are equally hostile to bank bailouts. They view financial institutions as predatory and executives as criminals. They demand that any crisis response include punishment for banks, debt forgiveness for consumers, and massive redistribution. Moderate proposals are unacceptable. The political math makes bailouts impossible. A 2026 version of TARP would need to pass the House, but 100-plus Republicans would refuse on populist grounds. 50-plus Democrats would refuse without progressive conditions attached. The votes don't exist. Even if leadership wants to act, they can't deliver votes. The Speaker of the House and Senate Majority Leader have limited control over their caucuses. Members answer to primary voters, not leadership. The party discipline that enabled 2008 cooperation doesn't exist. The legislative process has also broken down. In 2008, TARP moved quickly. Introduced September 20th, failed September 29th. Passed October 3rd, 2 weeks from introduction to enactment. Fast by any standard. In 2026, the process is slower and more chaotic. The debt ceiling is a recurring crisis, requiring weeks of negotiation. Regular appropriations bills can't pass, requiring continuing resolutions. The idea of passing major legislation in 2 weeks is fantasy. Moreover, any crisis response bill becomes a vehicle for unrelated priorities. Republicans demand spending cuts or regulatory rollbacks. Democrats demand tax increases on the wealthy or climate provisions. The bill becomes a 2,000-page omnibus that few understand and many oppose on principle. Social media amplifies opposition. Any provision in the bill becomes fodder for viral criticism. Members face instant constituent pressure via Twitter, Facebook, email blasts from advocacy groups. This pressure prevents the quiet deal-making that enabled past crisis responses. Primary challengers emerge immediately. Any Republican who votes for bailouts faces a primary opponent funded by populist donors. Any Democrat who votes for bank support without progressive conditions faces similar challenge. The electoral consequences are immediate and severe. The timing problem makes this worse. The crash doesn't wait for Congress. Markets move in days, banks fail in hours. By the time Congress negotiates, passes legislation through committees, brings it to the floor, the damage is catastrophic. The 2 to 3 week minimum legislative timeline is too slow. The coordination problem, when everyone must act together. Financial crises are global. They require coordinated international response. But the geopolitical environment in 2026 makes coordination nearly impossible. The institutional frameworks for cooperation have degraded while conflicts have intensified. In 2008, the G20 coordinated stimulus, central banks coordinated liquidity swaps and monetary policy. The IMF coordinated support for emerging markets. International institutions functioned. Countries cooperated despite differences. This cooperation reflected the post-Cold War consensus. Economic integration was desirable. International institutions were legitimate. U.S. leadership was accepted, if not always welcomed. Cooperation on economic crisis served everyone's interest. By 2026, this consensus is dead. Great power competition has returned. The U.S. and China are adversaries on most dimensions. Russia is effectively isolated. Europe is internally divided and externally weak. The Middle East is fragmenting. The global order is multipolar and conflictual. The practical implications are severe. Can the Federal Reserve provide unlimited dollar swap lines to the People's Bank of China during a crisis? The U.S. and China are in strategic competition. Technology controls, Taiwan tensions, South China Sea disputes. Providing financial support to a strategic rival is politically toxic. But the global financial system needs dollar liquidity. When crisis hits, dollar funding costs spike globally. Foreign banks and corporations need dollars. If the Fed doesn't provide swaps, the global dollar shortage becomes catastrophic. But providing swaps to China means supporting China's economy during rivalry. The same dilemma applies to other crisis coordination. Should the IMF provide support to countries aligned with China or Russia? Should the U.S. support European banks that have exposure to sanctioned Russian entities? Each decision involves geopolitics overriding economics. The institutional frameworks have also weakened. The IMF lacks resources for major crisis response without U.S. support. The World Bank is limited. The Bank for International Settlements can coordinate but can't compel. These institutions depend on member cooperation that may not exist. Regional differences compound coordination problems. Europe needs one set of policies given its economic structure. Emerging markets need different policies. The U.S. needs something else. In 2008, these differences were managed through compromise. In 2026, compromise is harder. Europe's internal divisions prevent coordinated action even within the EU. Germany opposes fiscal transfers. Southern Europe demands debt mutualization. Eastern Europe has different priorities. The European Central Bank is constrained by competing national interests. The Eurozone's structural problems, never solved after 2012, resurface. Italy's debt exceeds 140% of GDP. Without ECB support, Italy faces funding crisis. But German opposition limits ECB flexibility. The Eurozone could fracture during the crisis. Currency conflicts create another coordination problem. In crisis, countries benefit from currency depreciation. It makes exports competitive and imports expensive, supporting domestic production. But competitive devaluation is zero-sum. Everyone devaluing means no one gains. It just creates exchange rate chaos. Without coordination, countries will pursue beggar-thy-neighbor policies, intervene to weaken currencies, implement capital controls, restrict exports of critical goods. Each country acting in self-interest makes the global crisis worse. The coordination problem means that even if individual governments know what should be done, they can't execute without international cooperation. And the geopolitical environment makes that cooperation unlikely. The information problem also binds. Government officials can see aggregate vulnerabilities, but they can't see specific failures coming. They don't know which corporation will default first, triggering the cascade. They don't know which bank will fail. Preemptive action requires knowing specifics. Without specifics, any preemptive action is either too broad or too narrow. Too broad means wasting resources protecting entities that don't need protection. Too narrow means missing the actual failure point. Getting it right requires luck. The legal framework also prevents preemptive action. Many emergency powers require actual emergencies. The Fed Section 13-3 emergency lending requires unusual and exigent circumstances. Courts could challenge Fed actions taken before circumstances are clearly exigent. TARP required congressional authorization. Congress won't authorize $700 billion based on theoretical future crisis. They need actual crisis. Banks need to be failing. Markets need to be crashing. Only then does Congress act. This creates the paradox. Action is most effective before crisis, but only possible during crisis. By the time action is politically and legally possible, its effectiveness is reduced. The timing mismatch ensures that intervention is always reactive, never preventive. The political cycle creates additional timing problems. The 2026 crisis likely hits during an election year. The presidential election is November 2026. Campaign season starts earlier. No major legislation passes during election season. The political calendar prevents action during the critical period. Even when government officials understand the crisis and want to act, they face a narrative problem. They must explain complex financial dynamics to the public and Congress. This explanation must be convincing enough to justify unpopular actions. And in 2026, that explanation fails. In 2008, Paulson and Bernanke had a simple narrative. Banks are failing, credit is freezing. Without intervention, the economy collapses. Your 401k disappears, your job is at risk. This narrative worked. It was scary but comprehensible. Congress and the public could grasp it. The 2026 crisis involves more complex dynamics. Velocity collapse, collateral system breakdown. Rehypothecation chains, forced selling loops. These mechanisms are difficult to explain. Treasury secretaries aren't economics professors. Congressional members aren't financial experts. Try explaining to a congressional committee. The M2 velocity has collapsed to depression levels. This combined with elevated leverage creates conditions where forced selling from margin calls triggers liquidity cascades that break collateral chains, freezing markets despite adequate aggregate liquidity. The explanation is accurate, but it's incomprehensible to most listeners. They don't understand velocity. They don't know what collateral chains are. The technical accuracy works against effective communication. Simplifying the explanation makes it less convincing to experts, but still confusing to laypeople. Money isn't circulating enough, so the economy is fragile. This is too vague. It doesn't justify $2 trillion in spending. Moreover, the public has been told for years that the economy is fine. Markets at all-time highs, unemployment low, GDP growing. The narrative shift to actually we're facing catastrophic crisis lacks credibility. Why should people believe crisis warnings when everything looks fine? The trust problem amplifies this. Government officials and financial experts have low public trust. They predicted inflation was transitory. Wrong. They said housing never declines nationally. Wrong. They claimed subprime was contained. Wrong. The track record suggests skepticism is warranted. Social media ensures that any explanation gets attacked immediately. Expert economists might agree on the analysis. But Twitter erupts with criticism. Politicians amplify simplified counter-narratives. They're lying to bail out their Wall Street donors. This message is simpler and more emotionally resonant than technical explanations. Conspiracy theories flourish. The crisis is manufactured to justify bailouts. It's a deep state operation. It's billionaires manipulating markets. These narratives are factually wrong, but psychologically compelling. They spread faster than accurate explanations. The narrative problem means that even if government knows what's happening and wants to act, building political support is nearly impossible. The explanation doesn't convince, the public doesn't understand. The trust doesn't exist. Without public support, representatives won't vote for crisis response. Government faces a deeper constraint. The tools that might stop the 2026 crash are the same tools that created the vulnerabilities causing the crash. Using those tools again means doubling down on failed approaches. The post-2008 response involved zero interest rates and massive QE. This enabled the debt accumulation that created the 2026 maturity wall. It encouraged the leverage that makes the system fragile. It suppressed the velocity that needs to normalize. The solution became the problem. The post-2020 pandemic response involved even more aggressive intervention. Unlimited QE, direct payments to households, Paycheck Protection Program loans. This created the 2021-2022 inflation that constrains current policy. It added trillions more to debt. It further distorted markets. Using the same playbook in 2026 means expecting different results from the same actions. Zero rates enabled excessive leverage before. Why wouldn't they enable more leverage again? QE distorted asset prices before. Why wouldn't it create more distortions? The precedent problem is that each crisis response makes the next crisis worse. The 1987 response created the 1990s leverage boom that contributed to 2000. The 2000 response enabled 2008. The 2008 response enabled 2020. The 2020 response enabled 2026. At some point, this pattern must break. Continuing the same approach guarantees increasingly severe crises. But breaking the pattern means accepting a depression now to prevent catastrophe later. No political system willingly makes that choice. Government officials recognize this dilemma. They know that another round of zero rates and unlimited QE creates problems for the 2030s. But they also know that not intervening means accepting severe recession now. They're trapped between short-term political necessity and long-term economic sustainability. The precedent problem also creates moral hazard. Markets learned that government bails out excess. This encouraged more excess. Each bailout creates expectations of future bailouts, encouraging more risk-taking that requires future bailouts. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Breaking the cycle requires allowing failures. Let zombie companies default, let poorly managed banks fail, let excessive leverage unwind. This is the correct long-term approach. But short-term, it means depression. No elected official chooses depression. The precedent problem means government lacks credible alternatives. They can repeat failed approaches, knowing they create future problems. Or they can allow the crisis to run its course, accepting catastrophic short-term consequences. Neither option is acceptable. Both options are unavoidable. The fundamental constraint is that understanding a complex system doesn't mean you can control it. Government officials might understand every dynamic I've described. They might predict the crash accurately. This knowledge still doesn't create the power to prevent it. Complex systems have emergent properties. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. Interactions between components create outcomes that can't be prevented by targeting individual components. The financial system is such a complex system. You can understand that velocity collapse plus leverage plus maturity wall equals crisis, but preventing the crisis requires changing velocity or leverage or refinancing patterns. Each of these involves millions of individual decisions by households and corporations. Government can influence, but not control these decisions. Velocity is behavioral. It reflects confidence in economic activity. Government can stimulate to encourage spending. But if households choose to save anyway, velocity stays low. You can't mandate that people spend. You can't force velocity to rise. Leverage is similar. But corporate leverage, household leverage, shadow banking leverage exist outside traditional regulatory scope. Restricting one form just pushes activity to unregulated forms. The maturity wall is already locked in. The bonds were issued years ago with specific maturity dates. Government can't change these dates. They can create refinancing facilities, but only if they have fiscal space and political support, which, as discussed, they lack. The system has too many moving parts. Credit markets to equity markets, derivatives, repo, foreign exchange, housing, commercial real estate. Each market has its own dynamics. All are interconnected. Intervening in one creates unintended consequences in others. The speed of modern markets exceeds human response time. Algorithmic trading executes in microseconds. Bank runs happen in hours via mobile apps. By the time government officials convene meetings and decide responses, the situation has evolved. The response targets yesterday's problem. The knowledge action gap means that even perfect omniscient government would struggle to prevent the 2026 crash. The tools are insufficient. The constraints are binding. The system is too complex and too fast. Knowledge without power to execute is just frustration. Understanding that government can't stop the crash, even with perfect knowledge, changes how you should think about risk. Markets price and government backstops. The assumption that government will save markets supports current valuations. This assumption is false. When the crash comes and government response proves inadequate, the repricing is violent. Everything built on assumptions of government support collapses simultaneously. The gap between expected intervention and actual intervention is where catastrophic losses occur. The political dysfunction is visible now. The debt levels are public knowledge. The coordination problems are obvious. Yet markets ignore these realities. They assume that when crisis comes, somehow these constraints will disappear. They won't. The fiscal math is inescapable. Starting from 120% debt to GDP leaves no room for 2008-style response. The bond market arithmetic doesn't change because crisis arrives. Adding 40% more debt triggers sustainability questions, regardless of political will. The international fragmentation is accelerating, not improving. US-China tensions are worsening. European integration is under strain. These trends don't reverse during crisis, they intensify. Coordination becomes harder, not easier under stress. The precedent problem has no solution. Either repeat failed policies, creating worse future crises, or accept depression now. Governments will choose the former, making the eventual reckoning more severe. But the eventual reckoning is unavoidable. Government officials might see the crash coming. Some undoubtedly do, but seeing doesn't equal stopping. The constraints are structural, not informational. Knowledge of the problem doesn't create capacity to solve it. This is the harsh reality markets haven't priced in. When the 2026 crash hits, government will try everything. Emergency meetings, rate cuts, lending facilities, stimulus proposals, political speeches. None of it will be enough. Not because officials are incompetent or malicious, but because the system has become too leveraged, too fragile, too politicized, and too globally fractured for government intervention to work. This is why governments can't stop the 2026 crash. The fiscal space doesn't exist. The political will can't be summoned. The coordination can't be achieved. The timing doesn't align. The narrative doesn't convince. The precedents failed, and knowledge without power to execute is meaningless. The crash is coming, government knows. And government is powerless to prevent it. Understanding this reality is the first step to preparing for what comes next.